I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce today's guest presenter, Kirsten Vegas, Chief Knowledge Officer at NetForce Global. Kirsten is an industry veteran with over 30 years experience in employment screening. She has served in leadership positions with PBSA, including board participation and committee leadership. She currently serves on PBSA Education Committee, the Global Advisory Council, and assists other committees with general global and data protection needs. Kirsten joined NetForce Global in January 2019. She is responsible for leveraging knowledge within the organization to assist clients and their data subjects. Kirsten is one of the few individuals in the screening industry who is a Certified Information Privacy Professional, CIPP, through the International Association of Privacy Professionals. She holds CIPP certifications for Canada, EU, and U.S. private sector. Kirsten has a bachelor's degree from the University of Illinois in nursing. Outside of work, she is a volunteer for the National Park Service Chattahoochee National Recreation Area, where she helps to build and maintain hiking trails and assist with special events. Now I will turn over the presentation to Kirsten.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for giving me the opportunity today. So today I'm going to talk to you about international or global background screening. And in order to move forward, we have to put walls around what it is that we're really talking about. So we're going to focus primarily on the screening that is done from the United States when you're screening information for people that had been outside of the U.S. Maybe they went to school outside the U.S. or grew up or lived there, but you're really screening, for the most part, you're screening U.S. residents. International background screening does cover people who are living in other countries. It's actually quite common in many, many countries to do full sets of background screening, but there's additional layers of complexity when we're talking about that, and that would be a whole different seminar that we're going to talk about. So for the most part, again, we're looking at importing those non-U.S. records and record information into the United States. So this slide here tells you a little bit about the topics that we're going to go over, and we'll do a lot of comparing of how the background screens are outside of the United States, what the data is compared to what you're seeing here in the U.S. I will touch very, very briefly on privacy because that is a key issue that we have to worry about when we're doing global screening, and including in the United States as well. So what is global screening? We use the term international and global interchangeably, and this term international or even foreign can be very situational. So if you're here in the United States and you're pulling information that comes from Canada, that Canadian data is your international data. People might say that the U.S. data is called domestic data, but if you're sitting in Canada and you're pulling data from the United States, the Canadian data is domestic and the U.S. data is actually international. So whenever you're talking to anybody around the world about screening, be very clear when you use that term international and domestic, because it can have different meanings to different people depending on where your feet are. And you'll hear me refer to that term before, again, about where your feet are. You may have worked with screening providers, several different screening providers, and they say that, oh, we do international screening from all countries in the world. We do them from 180 countries or 240. I've seen as many as 280 countries listed. And you might wonder, why is one company not able to get as many searches as another company is able to get? They actually may be covering the same territory, the same part of the world. What's really interesting is that there is no definition of what is a country. If you look at the ISO definitions, you'll see Puerto Rico listed as a country, even though they're not. And Puerto Rico is also a representative in the Olympic Games, as I understand it. So don't get too tied up in the numbers of countries that are serviced. Make sure that the countries that you need to have serviced are what you're looking for. If you want to have a humorous view of just, what's the definition of a country, and there's several other videos that they have as well. There's a YouTube guy called CGP Grey, Grey. You can search for him on YouTube, and they're about 10-minute clips, and they're just hilarious on what the definition of a country is, and also what's the difference between the UK, Wales, Scotland, and that. So I definitely recommend that for some entertainment. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to dig into looking at the most common global searches that are ordered by customers, by employers, and general customers in the United States. And as you might expect, the first thing that comes up is the global criminal history search. So when we have a global search, there are two main scopes. There's local and there's national. And the sources of these criminal record searches come from a variety of places. So we go to the courts. Sometimes, very often in a country, there's a Ministry of Justice, or maybe Ministry of Security or Ministry of Public Security, something like that. That may be the source. Sometimes our sources are the police. And then there's a document that is very common outside the U.S., and it's called a certificate. And it could be a certificate of no criminal records or no criminal conviction. That means that you basically have a clean record. If you don't have a clean record, then you're not issued this document. It could be a certificate of good behavior. It could be a certificate of behavior. I'm not sure if there is such a thing as a certificate of bad behavior, but that would be the opposite, obviously, of the good behavior. Or just any other names. There's multiple different names of these, but literally it is a piece of paper. And on this screen, if you look at the top left picture, that is a sample of a police certificate that came from Australia. So that's one type of source and criminal record that we can get. And then if we go to the courts, sometimes that court view can give us a view of the entire country. So even if we go to a court, we may have a national view. And sometimes the court view is very local and only the coverage for that court. And then sometimes we have to go to the police, and then the locale that we're searching is really just that police jurisdiction, although sometimes the police have a view into the criminal records for the entire country. So you can't really always tell if it's going to be local or national based upon what the source is. There's another type of name or terminology that you may hear when you're talking about international criminal records, and they may be referred to as criminality. And criminality can be a couple different things. It could be a proprietary database that covers, maybe multiple official sources like the courts and ministries and police and that. Maybe it's supplemented with news information and sometimes sanctions information. Or it could be only this negative media stuff. We also call that adverse media. So again, criminality could be official sources plus something else, or just the official sources using multiple sources, or it could be negative media accounts. Sometimes criminality also refers to sanction searches. Here in the U.S., you're probably very familiar with OFAC. There are multiple sanctions in the U.S. There's multiple worldwide sanctions, and so sometimes these criminality databases can also be these sanctions, or they may be combined with adverse media. The one thing that is really a good practice in the background screening community is that a negative media or a sanction search is clearly labeled as that. We don't want to say, oh, we do a criminal record search and have that be an adverse media search. We want to definitely define so that the users of the background screening information know what the limitations of the source could be if it's adverse media or sanctions. So what you'll usually see is the criminal record being labeled as national or local or nationwide or local, and then there may be a different type of search. At NetForce, we call it an illicit activity database that has maybe these proprietary databases and the adverse media and the sanctions information. So let's take a look at how this compares to the U.S. So in the U.S., the primary source is the county courts. That's where you're going to get your most accurate information, and that would be a local search. It's an address-based search. Internationally, as I said before, the primary source can really vary a great deal by that country. It can be anything from the courts, ministry, police. In the U.S., we have a common search type now. It's called a multi-jurisdictional search. You may have heard of the name a national criminal file. That's very common, hopefully used as a supplement to what you're doing for your local criminal search. And it's a very good search, but it wouldn't have every single thing in it. So it's a proprietary database. That's where these national criminal files come from. Outside of the U.S., there are a couple proprietary databases, good proprietary databases. You'll see here I've listed Japan and the Philippines as examples. And they come from multiple court information in Japan. It's actually supplemented with adverse media information that's really quite good, which is unusual, and some other sanctions and information. In the Philippines, it comes from multiple court sources and that. But other than that, proprietary databases are pretty rare. A lot of the privacy laws don't allow for them to be created. So you're not going to find that national criminal file or multi-jurisdictional type search. What you do tend to find is that there's one type of search or another that's really the predominant or recommended search. So here in the U.S., again, many people will do the county courts, that local search, plus that national multi-jurisdictional search. Globally, you'll find in a country it's either a local search is the predominant search, or it's that national search that may be coming from the ministry or the certificates in that. You rarely find two primary sources. Canada is the big exception on that, and there's actually a good local product and there's also a good national product. They each have their positives and their negatives. So when we take a look at the supply chain, background screeners are not able to do everything by themselves. There's a very complex and rich supply chain that supports what we do for a living. And in the U.S., it's very, very good. We've done background screening for many decades, and we have a lot of people and companies and services that support what we do to be able to help our end user customers. Outside of the U.S., it is a whole lot better than it used to be, but the world is a huge place. So some countries have a far richer supply chain. Other countries are still developing in that. And that's why you might see some areas of the world where you can get quick and very good and very full depth information. In other countries, even what seems to be the most basic search can be very, very difficult. So it is getting better. The supply chain globally is getting better every single day, but it is certainly not globally at the level that we experience here in the United States. As I mentioned before, we have a clear distinction in the United States of this local search. That's your county or maybe a statewide criminal record search. We have that multi-jurisdictional search for national. When we get outside of the U.S., then the lines can be a little blurred. We may have a national search that covers most of the national. We may have a local search that covers actually most of the national, but has some more depth into a particular area, maybe police station or a court. So you'll find a little bit of fuzziness with that. And again, the background screening community, we want to make sure that we're transparent about it. So if you're going to do a national search that doesn't have really, really good breadth, is really mostly focused on the local area, even though you could have some information from the entire country in there, background screeners will tend to call that a local search because we don't want to mislead companies and think that they're going to get the full coverage from the entire country. In terms of how far back these searches go, in the U.S., typically they're going back for 7 years. You can try and order 10-year searches. They may cost more and take a little longer, but the standard is really that 7-year history look back. Globally, that depth is going to vary by every single country, and I don't even have a list of how far they go back in each country. So sometimes it can go back maybe to the person's 18th birthday. Sometimes it can go back for as long as that entity, maybe the ministry, was collecting data. Sometimes it can go back 3 years or 4 years or 5 years. So it really is going to vary. So if you're going to ask your provider and say, I want to have 7 years felony misdemeanor searches everywhere in the world, that's going to be very difficult to do because it doesn't really exist. So while we're on that topic of felony and misdemeanors, we divide things in the U.S. into that higher and lower level of criminal records, that felony and misdemeanors. The terms felony and misdemeanor very rarely exists outside the U.S. They may have a higher or lower level type of conviction, but in a lot of countries, a crime is a crime, and they don't even divide it into that. So there isn't a higher and a lower level. So that can also vary quite a bit. There's a term that we have internationally that comes up quite often, and it's called spent records. And these are searches that have been shielded from view. They're still in the system, so the police can still see it, the judges can still see it, maybe even for certain types of screens, like if an individual is caring for the vulnerable, those may be revealed. But to the general population, if we're going to do a regular search for a general person, we would not get information that's spent. So a spent record, the individual has to have fulfilled some terms of their sentence. So they've completed their sentence, they've not recidivated for a certain period of time. In many countries, the records are automatically spent. So it may say if you have incarceration of a year and you kept yourself clean for 3 years, then it's automatically spent after 3 years. Or in some cases, like in Canada, they call it a record suspension there. In Canada, you have to request, you have to make an appeal for a record suspension. So the closest thing that we see to a spent record regime is maybe sealed records, but they're far more common out than what you would see with sealed records here in the U.S. So very often you will see that the background check report will report everything but spent records, and that's what it's talking about, that if there was a record that the person has successfully met those requirements, and in that country, then it becomes more sealed and we can't get to it unless that country has a mechanism where for certain job positions, usually those are for the vulnerable, that we would be able to get that record. So that's very, very common. In terms of ease of ordering in the U.S., really easy to order a criminal record search. I think sometimes all you need to have is a Social Security number. Basically we ask for a Social Security number, full name, including middle name, alias names, dates of birth, and address so that we know where to check. And sometimes you don't even need all that information. Internationally, that could be what is required to be able to order that criminal record search. Or it can go on a spectrum where it is extremely difficult. You have to have multiple forms that are witnessed by a person at arm's length in relationship to you, that have original signatures with copies of ID and copies and proof of address. So, the really, really difficult ones are rare, but they are out there. And then we can have everything in between. I'd say most commonly we need to have that full name. We need to have, for a local search, we need to know where you want us to look at, so we need to have an address. We may need a country ID number or a copy of the country ID, or sometimes we're able to do that with a passport. Some countries may have multiple types of IDs or tax IDs, and it could be specific as to what type of ID we need to have. And then for criminal records, not uncommon that we have to have a special form, and then just be prepared. Sometimes those forms can have very special requirements to them. And the other thing about these ordering requirements is they change. And they change sometimes without warning. All of a sudden, some ministry will change a form, and then tomorrow they don't accept the old form, and they haven't really given anybody any warning. Or the ministry will say, on Tuesday, this is changing, and that's it. So everybody down that food chain really has to adapt. And if you get those changed forms, it's not the AccuSource folks' fault. It's very often it was changed at the source level, and they didn't give people a lot of warning for it. So be on the lookout for that. And then lastly, with turnaround time, it's usually in the U.S. Many of these criminal searches are instant. Turnaround time probably is like 1 to 2 days, very, very quickly done. Right now, it's a little longer because of the court situation, but for the most part, it's less than 2 days. Internationally, we do see turnaround time of a couple days sometimes. Usually it's around 5 days. It can be weeks. And now with COVID too, we're seeing some delays as well. I just saw that I think the Greek government has shut down their access again and delayed a lot of their access. So the turnaround time is going to be variable there. What you notice, what you did not see, is that we don't have instant searches internationally. Those sanctions searches, maybe adverse media, can be instant, but they're not the true criminal records. And then one more thing about this permissible purpose. You're used to doing permissible purpose here in the U.S. Your permissible purpose for some searches may be employment. It may be with consent by the request of the consumer. And internationally, that permissible purpose will vary. And this is one of these things that's really complex when you're screening in other countries. For example, in the EU, we would not be able to use a permissible purpose for employment screening because of the way that the laws are written there. So we are sometimes doing a permissible purpose by consent, and sometimes it's using some other mechanism that the employer may have. Maybe they have a legal requirement to do so. So that's criminal records, the most complex part of what we're going to cover. Let's take a look at credit reports. And here again, we see a lot of variances in what's out there. And we can have a true credit report, what you're familiar with seeing with the debt to payment history and a detailed maybe year or two payment history. You'll see here's an example of a credit report, and it shows a score. If there's a true credit report, we very often get that credit score. There's no way of filtering that out. Sometimes it's just it's a public record. It could be what we call a CCJ, a civil court judgment, which is when the debtor took the creditor took the debtor to court to be able to collect. Sometimes it's published in a gazette, like in the media. Sometimes the sources are going to the banks, and we're looking at that. I'd say if in all of the countries where there's some type of credit information, usually it's going to be getting that civil court judgments and maybe insolvency and bankruptcy information. The true credit report that we're used to seeing in the United States is really, really rare to be able to get. So let's compare that to what we see in the United States. Again, in the U.S., the source is the credit bureaus. Outside the U.S., we see a whole variety of sources that we're looking at. In the U.S., you're going to find bankruptcy information is going to be on that credit report for up to 10 years. Outside, we may have bankruptcy insolvency information. Maybe we may not. Or maybe the report, all it really is bankruptcy insolvency. That could be the primary part of what's in that report. In the U.S., there's two types of credit reports. There's one for use with creditors when they're giving out loans of some type, and then there's one for employment purposes. They're actually coded differently when they're sent to the credit bureaus. The ones for employment purposes do not show the credit score. So if you're doing it for employment purposes, there's just no way that we can squeeze a credit score in there because it just doesn't come on our version of the report. And then if you're in the loan industry, then that type of credit report will come with a credit score. Outside the U.S., you don't find two types of credit report. There is a credit report. If you're getting a full credit report, it is the full credit report, and very often it will have that credit score on it. Ordering requirements in the U.S., really, name, date of birth, social security number, very easy. Outside the U.S., occasionally we can have easy ordering requirements like that, but don't be surprised if you're asked, especially to provide a copy of an ID, or maybe some other information, sometimes address information on there as well. Not usually as complex as we see with the criminal records, but it certainly is more than we're used to in the U.S. And then lastly, in the U.S., they're pretty instant. I think they take less than 2 days unless there's some additional work that has to be done on public records like bankruptcies. Outside the U.S., it can be quick. It's not going to be instant. It usually is several days. So, motor vehicle records. You're probably not doing a whole lot of international motor vehicle records. These tend to be done when you're screening somebody in another country, but occasionally, I think especially with Canada, this may come up for you. We can see the scope can either be the entire country, so you can have a single motor vehicle record that will cover the entire country, or it can be state specific. Canada is state-specific, as is Australia and Brazil. And then the results of it they really have two polar opposites. One of it is just a validation of that license that says, yes, it is a valid license, or yes, this license has been issued. And then you can have a validation of license, and you can have citations, like what we're used to seeing in the U.S., where you have a lot more information about the person's driving history and maybe demerits or points or something, and convictions. So we'll see a breadth of that. It could be anything in between that. If I had to say, on average, throughout the entire world, mostly it's just going to be that validation of a license. We tend not to see those full license driving history that we're used to here in the U.S. Canada, we are able to get full driving history. In all of the provinces, Alberta, however, does not allow third parties to access this, so you wouldn't be able to get a driving history in Alberta. The sources, sometimes they come from, there's transport ministries or interior ministries, so that could be our source. Sometimes the driver's license ministries, or drivers, kind of like DMVs that we see internationally, and that could either be for the country as a whole, or it could be statewide. Occasionally we go to the police, and then sometimes it's really just looking at an ID validation of the document. So let's compare that to the U.S. Just as we see before, in the U.S., a single source, that would be our State Department of Motor Vehicles. Globally, we see a broader range of sources that's going to vary by country. The scope in the U.S. is state-specific. Scope worldwide could be state-specific, or it could be countrywide. U.S. provides full validation of the license and violation history. The international scope could be just validating the license. It could be providing the violation history. It could be providing limited violations. Any combination of that. U.S., I think the turnaround time is less than 2 days. I don't know if there's any instant searches here or not, but they are pretty quickly done here. Internationally, the turnaround time can be a couple days to actually quite a long time, especially if the individual has to send in original documents. Occasionally we see that. So that turnaround time is going to vary quite a bit. And then in the U.S., that access is available to third parties. Globally, it's not necessarily a given. And then we do see where we can have most states available in a country, and then maybe 1 or 2 states will have some restrictions that make it either impossible or difficult for us to be able to get it. So Canada, again, as I mentioned before, with Alberta. In Brazil, there's a couple states that are difficult to get information from, or that we're not able to as a third party. Australia, we have the same issue there as well. So that can vary. And then I'm going to touch on global verifications. And you would think that global verifications would be the most common thing. I mean, employment is employment and school is school, right? And not the case. And really, it's the education verification that has the most variances. So I'll talk about that. So we do most often, we'll do that confirmation of the graduation. Confirming attendance is not always able to be done. So very often we can do it, but it's not going to be a given. And the sources internationally is we're going directly to those. If we're doing an employment verification, going directly to the employer, going directly to that school. And the ordering requirement, here's where it's a little different, and this causes a lot of distress with end users. So we often require a copy of the diploma. And the customers will say, well, why do I have to give you a copy of what I'm telling you to tell me? Why should I give you a copy of the diploma? You're supposed to tell me that this person actually got their diploma. And there's many reasons for it. Primarily, well, number one is the source requires it. So if the school says we want a copy of the diploma, we are not getting that verification unless we have a copy of that diploma. But there's also, you could have multiple, in a university, you can have multiple colleges. So it really winnows down exactly where we need to look, or where the school needs to look. We know the name exactly as it was when they graduated, in the language and the script as when they graduated, which is very, very important. So, and there's other identifiers sometimes on those diplomas that are really needed. So not every country is like this, but many, many countries we do need a copy of that diploma. And then in some countries, especially in India, you may find a requirement for what's called a mark sheet. It's kind of like a transcript. And then we can sometimes need to have IDs, or occasionally we need to have special forms. So you'll see that as well. So that's the main difference. So very quickly, compare that to what we see here in the U.S. Now in the U.S. we have sources. There are very good and very common third-party databases that are used for employment and for education verification. They're starting to build these internationally, so there's a couple countries. South Africa, for example, has a school database. Canada has a very small school database. So there are a few that are out there, but it's really, really rare. And the same thing with the employment databases, really, really rare. Sometimes they're not allowed to put them together, and sometimes really the schools are very protectionist about not wanting to share their information. And it can be a fundraising mechanism for them. They don't want to give that up. So in the U.S., that school or employer authenticity, it can be an issue. Oh, you may have heard about the diploma mills and lifestyle schools. This is a problem here in the U.S., and there's also a problem of fake references. There's companies that are set up so that they can provide a fake employment reference. So we do have this problem, but this is a huge, huge issue internationally. And some of these diploma mills actually exist in these other countries. There's a very famous one that hit the news a couple years ago in Pakistan, a company called Exact, X-A-C-T, I think is how it's spelled. And if you're interested in this whole concept, you may want to read up on it. It's quite fascinating. So it's not just in the developing world that we have an issue with fake employers and diploma mills, but even in like in the UK, they have a huge, huge problem with diploma mills there as well. And then this is something we don't see a lot here in the US, but so we have companies that are set up to provide a fake employment verification, but internationally you can have a rogue manager who is going to take some extra money on the side. And so maybe you did work there, but your reference wouldn't be quite the same. So these rogue managers will provide that as well. So in some countries, you will also see that it's common to have a white and black list of schools and employers that have been vetted to confirm that they are legitimate, and then there's also blacklists of organizations that have not been confirmed to be legitimate. So that can be something. Now in the U.S., if you've done education verifications, you may have hit up with FERPA restrictions, and that means that information is going to be shielded, and the screening company cannot get that information out of the school, maybe without some interaction from the candidate. FERPA does not exist outside the U.S., but what we do struggle with is sometimes the data protection laws. And some countries, right now we're having a big problem in Poland because of the data protection regulator there and how they have interpreted the laws and provided guidance about employers should not be even going to a school to confirm education verification. It's not legal. It's not guidance that has the force of law, but it makes sometimes getting some of the verifications out of Poland a little bit difficult. So we do occasionally get schools and sometimes employers, even when we hand a copy of that consent from the individual, where they'll say, oh, we can't release this information due to data protection laws. So obviously everybody in the providing chain tries to work with that source, but if they refuse, they simply refuse. So the ordering requirements in the U.S., I know that they may be, it may seem like it takes a long time and it's hard to do, but they really are much easier. In a lot of other countries, as I said, we have to have a copy of that diploma, maybe a mark sheet, sometimes special forms, sometimes we have to have a copy of that ID. In some countries, you even have to have the individual still call the school or contact the school to provide a secondary consent. It's rare, but it does happen. In the U.S., obviously, those verifications are going to be done in English. Internationally, those verifications often have to be done in the local language. And sometimes they can be done in English, and it can be done fairly easy. But very often it has to be done in that local language and using the customs that are traditional in that country. the call and contact schedule, and that's, how often do we call? You call, you make a contact, you leave a message, and you wait, and then you're going to contact again at some period of time. And in the U.S., it's a fairly consistent schedule culturally that we have. Internationally, that recontact schedule really does need to be localized. So in some cultures, you need to call every day. In other cultures, if you call every day, nobody will ever talk to you again. So you have to be very, very careful about the sensitivity of that particular culture. And then with that turnaround time, if we're able to use databases, then that can be very, very quick. Typically in the U.S., it's going to be a few days. If there's holidays or in the summer, then it can be a little slowed down. But internationally, the turnaround time can be very long, especially if it's holidays and vacations. And we'll talk about that shortly. So that is just going through the main differences in the searches with the U.S. And the international searches. So here's just a summary of that. So in the U.S., again, our data fields are going to be fairly minimal, usually just name, date of birth, social security number, addresses. And again, when we're talking name, it's really, really important to get that full name, including those middle names. Globally, when we're talking names, we not only need to have their full name, but we may need parents' name, mother's maiden name, sometimes I've even had forms where it had grandparents' names on it. We need ID numbers or copies of IDs, sometimes very specific IDs, and we may need an address proof. Occasionally, we need to have those original signatures as well. A click signature on a consent form is likely not going to be accepted. Mouse or finger signature is going to be more accepted. Occasionally, we need to have things in blue ink. I've seen even things specified that much. U.S.-wise, we rarely have a special form. I know it does come up here and there, but that doesn't happen that often. Internationally, special forms, not uncommon, especially for criminal records and motor vehicle records. We do sometimes have to have original signatures. We may need to have a witness, and a few times those documents may need to be notarized. When we talk about a notice is the statement that you give to the individual that tells them about the processing of their information. So that is required here in the U.S. The FCRA has some language that is required. Some states, California has some language that is required. Internationally, that notice may be extremely prescriptive. And a good example is the European Union with their privacy regulation GDPR. There is a whole section, I think it's Article 9, that talks about exactly what needs to be put in that notice to the individual. So you need to make sure that if for some reason you are screening somebody in another country, that you have the proper information in that notice. And then consent is actually separate from the notice. You've told them what they're doing, and now you're getting their permission to be able to do it. The consent for background screening is required, but you rarely have to submit that with your background check. If you're doing mobile checking in that, it's part of the information that is captured in that mobile process. But if you're doing things manually in that, you very rarely have to provide a copy of that consent. The screening company may audit you to make sure that you've held on to it, that you have it, but you don't have to give it up at the time of screening. It's presumed. Globally, that copy of consent is usually required. So that just be prepared that it's got to be provided up. So in addition to that very prescriptive notice, there may be some very prescriptive language that has to be on a copy of consent. And we'll see that if we have maybe for a certain search type, there might be a certain search type like a criminal record search in a particular country that may come along with a certain notice and a consent just for that particular screening itself when we're talking about things being very prescriptive. All right, so I talked about turnaround time, and I alluded to vacations and holidays. Turnaround time in the U.S., when we're working internationally, we are so jealous of the U.S. because it is really fairly quickly done. I know it may not seem that way, but it is really fairly quickly done. So maybe about 2 days or less, I guess, is probably the average turnaround time. Again, now is a little bit of a different situation, but most of the time it's usually around 2 days. Internationally, I'd say a good turnaround time is 5 days, and it can span really sometimes much longer than that. So it can go on for maybe a couple weeks. In some countries, we tend to see a turnaround time that's around 8 or 9 days. In the U.S., we don't have the luxury of having a lot of holidays. I think there's about 6 holidays that are sort of standard. I know there's more bankers' holidays, but about 6 standard holidays. And internationally, there are a whole lot more holidays. This is actually a picture of the calendar year 2021 for India for the holidays. So the things that are in red are federal holidays, and the circles in blue are the local holidays. And sometimes holidays internationally, they go on for a whole week. So there's a holiday in China and Japan. It's called Golden Week. It is a whole week, and most stores may be open, but government offices and businesses like background screening suppliers and that are going to be closed. And not only do you have the closure for the week, but when they come back the following week, you have a backlog that everybody has to work through. Or holidays that are 2 or 3 days are not that uncommon. And then we also see, seasonal variations. So, we joke that you're just not going to get anything done for an employment or education verification in Italy in August because, that's vacation time. But basically all of Southern Europe really, really slows down in August. So that really impacts employment and education verifications. So just be aware of the impact, the bigger impact of holidays that we do see internationally. And another thing is, and this is, I hope that this illustrates, how much more complex things are when we're doing something internationally. So this flow chart here is one version of a criminal record search in France. So you'll see here that this involves sending things via postal mail that takes 14 days. That is if the French post office does not go on strike or lose the mail. And you see all the moving pieces to be able to get this done. And this is not that, this is a little bit more complicated than normal, but not that much more in a lot of cases. So you can see how much more complex this is doing it internationally. We don't have the level of digitized data, especially in some countries. If we're going into a developed country, very often it's very, very paper-based. And there's a lot of people involved, and that's a source of a lot of employment. And there's a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of stamps. So those all make things a lot slower than what we're used to here in the U.S. Basically, some of the more developing countries will have more manual processing. But even here, France is definitely a developed country, and you see how that there's a lot of manual pieces to this as well. All right, just a summary again, because I know criminal records is really one of the key areas that customers are looking for. And so again, there's that 2 different types of criminal records. We've got that national, which is not going to be address-based, and then we have that local, which is address-based. That local could be any variety of things. It could be a whole state, or it could be just a jurisdiction, police or court jurisdiction. And then, in the U.S., that national search is that multi-jurisdictional, that NatCrim type search, or you could even consider the FBI database if you're doing fingerprinting, that could be a national search. In the U.S., that local search is like a statewide or the county court searches. And as I said before, you tend to find one type that's predominant in a country. Although there's other good reasons to use a different type, but there is basically one go-to type. The exception is in Canada, where there are actually 2 go-to types, each of them with their positives and with their negatives. Okay. So I said that we would speak just a little bit about privacy, and I think the main message there is that the FCRA is not a global law. So the FCRA is not going to impact what happens outside the U.S. Now the good thing is that the principles that underline the FCRA are the same principles that we find in privacy laws all around the world, They do get layered on sometimes with much more complexity in other countries, but there's some very same things. You know, there's providing information to the individual, giving them access to their data. There's a requirement for security. There's a requirement for accuracy. So those things are things that we see in any country that has privacy regulations, and that's also key to the FCRA. But that FCRA will not apply outside the U.S. So sometimes if we have to give a copy of an FCRA worded consent, notice of consent, that may not be sufficient if we're trying to get information out of another country, and then they may require their own country's language, specific language, and that's where we find those criminal record searches that have the specialized notice and consent forms. If for some reason you are going to screen somebody who is not in the U.S. at the time of screening, the FCRA really isn't going to matter. What is going to matter is the regulations in the country where that person's feet are. Also outside the U.S., you know, not all searches are allowed for all positions. And sometimes they're not even available, that we can't even get it. So Ireland is a good example. In Ireland, the criminal record searches come from the Garda, from the police. There's a special unit that provides that information. You can only get the criminal record searches for individuals who are caring for the vulnerable, and there's a handful of other types of job positions that they're available. You can get them for some regulated financial positions. But the Garda will not give us, you know, if you're screening somebody here in America, they are not going to give us that criminal record certificate from here, from the United States. And then if you're in another country, even if the information is available, there may be restrictions on that as well. So it can get very, very complex, and it can be very strange if you're looking at it from an American risk eye. So that is about all I can say on global privacy without taking another couple hours to go through it. And I'd like to open it up for questions now.
Thank you, Kirsten. Now we will dedicate the remainder of the webinar to addressing attendee questions. If you have not had a chance to ask a question via our chat box, please feel free to do so now.
Thanks, Heidi. The first question that we have, Kirsten, is doesn't the government do background screening on individuals coming into the U.S. to work? And why can't we rely on just that?
So that would be part of the whole visa process, and there is a level of screening that is done in the visa process, and so that does help. However, it's not going to be as comprehensive. So first of all, it will likely not cover all of the things that you need to know about the individual. You know, so that visa process may take a look at some portion of their criminal history, but you wouldn't have the information about any employment or education history that they had outside the U.S. And that's something that just as in the U.S., you know, you really need to make sure that is as stated. With respect to the criminal history, a lot of times the person just has to get that certificate of criminal records. So number one, you have a document that's been out of official custody and control, and you'll notice a lot of the examples that I had in this presentation, these were real searches, and I sampled them up. I used Adobe and made it say what I wanted it to say. So nowadays with computers, you can do a lot with documents. And then sometimes that it may give you a reduced scope. So if I can get a certificate in Brazil, I can get a federal criminal record certificate that's for federal crimes, really pretty useless. But the real level of crimes that you want to know about is anything that's held statewide. So, you know, the government's got a little bit of a snapshot about the person, but they really don't have the real snapshot out of it. So I wouldn't rely on a visa as my sole source for checking up on an individual.
Fantastic. Thanks for answering that. The next question is, why can't I just run a global criminal file search for all international criminal records? I see them advertised.
That's kind of what we discussed in the very beginning. We talked about this concept of a criminality search. So there's no single criminal database that covers the world like we have with the U.S. National Criminal or Multi-Jurisdictional File. And more than likely, what these criminality or these global criminal record searches are is they're probably a global sanctions search. And these sanctions search, I mean, they can have hundreds and sometimes thousands of sources in there, but looking at a person's sanction history and looking at their criminal history are two different things, because you can be sanctioned without having criminal history, and you can have criminal history without it showing up in the sanctions. Very often that's what's going to be the case. Sometimes these global criminal record searches are also adverse media searches. As I said, it's taking a look at news media, published media, and where you find that person's name listed. And you can see the problem with that automatically. If you have a common name and you're checking that person's name throughout all 240 countries in the world, how do you know that the person that you're checking is who you're trying to search? So it's very hard to have enough identifiers to report anything either. There's good reasons to use these as a supplement, but that's not the same thing as going to the official criminal record source, going to that ministry, getting that certificate, going to the police, and checking what's available as part of their criminal history. So if somebody's talking about an international criminal record thing, it's probably going to be that as sanctions and or a media search, which is a different product, has its use, but it's a different product than a criminal record search.
All right. The next question is, what products might be run for a comprehensive search?
Partially that's going to be dependent upon the industry that is being worked in. And then when you're also, so some industries have, standards for the industry. So for example, if there's a particular license that is required for the work, sometimes you'll want to run a professional license. Some industries have requirements that you have to do certain levels of searches, for so far back. So I think the healthcare, hospitals especially, industry has those requirements. I think regulated financial positions, they have certain requirements as well for that. And then you have to take a look at the reputation, the potential reputational impact of your company and that position. So if it's a very high level position where there's a huge potential of reputational impact, good or bad, then there's going to be a broader array that you would want to do. You might want to do those sanctions and the adverse media searches if reputation is a big risk. For most positions where certain schooling is required, you definitely want to check out the relevant non-U.S. school history and confirm the legitimacy of any stated claims. And then the same thing for employment history, because the person's experience is in a way almost like your education. I mean, that's the body of knowledge that they carry, and you want to make sure that they actually do have that experience that they have. So I'd say verifications are really, really important. Criminal records, if you're doing criminal records for that level of position in the U.S., it would be, I think, discriminatory if you didn't do the same wherever possible outside of the U.S. And again, that's also going to tell you a lot. It's a risk mitigation as well as something to preserve your reputation. Driving history, internationally is something I wouldn't recommend doing a driving check as a way to do an ID check. Driving history really should only be done if it's going to be relevant to that position. So if for some reason you needed to know the person's past driving history in that other country, then there's going to be some relevance to it. But if not, then I think that would be over the top. And credit history, just like in the U.S., we don't see credit reports used to be very, very common, but we're seeing less and less of it. And so you probably, if you're not going to do a credit report here in the U.S., and if the person's past bankruptcy history was not important, to that position, then there wouldn't be a good reason to be able to do that internationally for that. So basically, it's, mostly it's going to be the criminal records. It's going to be checking the employment and the education history. For certain regulated positions and high-profile positions, you definitely want to look at maybe adverse media and sanctions in addition to that.
Fantastic. So we're almost at the end of our time, so this will be the final live question. Again, attendees, if you entered a question into the chat box and we didn't have the opportunity to address it live, our team will follow up with you directly post-webinar to provide an answer. Kristen, this is kind of a two-part question. So the first part is, what is GDPR? And the second part is, what does it matter to me?
Yeah, GDPR. GDPR matters a lot, especially if you want to have anything to do with California, because the new California privacy law is referred to as the California's GDPR. So GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation, and it is the, well, not so new anymore, privacy regulation in the European Union, covering 27 European Union member states, and the UK has its own version called the Data Protection Act 2018. And data protection is really, really critical internationally. Where in the U.S., protection of individuals' information is important to us, more so commercially, but in a lot of countries, especially in the EU, it is a fundamental human right, and people know their rights and they're rabid about it as well. And companies can get huge fines for violating data protection. And so what you're seeing in California with the new regulations there have many similarities to what we see in GDPR. And because GDPR has data, cross-border data transfer requirements, has regulations and restrictions on how and when you can send personal information across a country border, many countries in the world are remodeling or creating data protection regulations that meet and exceed the GDPR. So everybody wants to be able to trade with the EU and manage the data there. So, and data protection regulations and restrictions are some of the key obstacles that we have in moving data around the world and doing background checks. So there are very specific requirements that we all have to meet in order to process personal information, even if it's from an American resident. But we're pulling information from other countries, and sometimes that comes under those international data protection restrictions. So it's important to you because it is becoming the worldwide standard, and it can be quite restrictive. It does offer individuals a lot of rights, a lot of very good rights about how their information is handled and their ability to determine what happens with their information. But that's really why it's important for everybody to be able to understand that. And again, there are some similarities with the FCRA, but the implementation is much more rigid than what we're seeing with the FCRA. I hope it answered the question.
Thank you, Kirsten, for facilitating this informative webinar, and special thanks to our attendees for joining us today.